Our last speaker of the session is Richard Harral. So Richard trained as an architect at Newcastle University prior to working at Cumbrian County Council Design and Build, Ashida Finley Architects and Bushkill Henley Architects before running his own successful private practice for a number of years. In 1997 he became Principal Architect of the Department of Community and Local Government and then Head of Technical Policy in the Building Regulations Division in 2014 in the UK. Is responsible for development and introduction of optional requirements into the building regulations, including the development of age-friendly and wheelchair housing standards in Part M. He also oversaw the development and introduction of the nationally described space standard and new regulations for domestic security standards in Part Q of the UK building regs. Today, his contribution to the quality agenda is going to look at possibilities of how we could adopt more standardisation and modular approach to construction. This is an area he's been working in recently, so it's fresh and relevant material. So we'll ask Richard to give the final presentation before lunch.
So firstly, thank you very much for inviting me here today. It's my first trip to GMIT. It's been a great agenda so far this morning, really great speakers. A lot of commonality and themes. And before I start, I want to pick up on something Chris said about competency. At the moment, I'm involved in a lot of work in the UK on competency, directly involved from the Hackett review process. It's going to be a step change in the way that people are assessed in the UK, initially for high-risk residential buildings, but I think it's going to be something that will spread across the industry. And we're going to be moving not just to a process of assessing competence, but revalidation over time. So for all of those people who are starting out in the industry here, thinking about working in the UK perhaps, but I think generally in construction, it's going to be one of the single biggest changes in your career experience compared to those of people like me who've worked before you. So I'd urge you to embrace that. I think it's going to be good for everybody, and it's going to be good for the value of construction. So initially, I was discussing whether we should talk about competence at this session. It's a really important issue, but there's nothing more likely to create death by PowerPoint than talking about competence for half an hour. It's a pretty dry subject, and it's text-based. And I thought it would be much more interesting to talk about some of the work I've done over the last couple of years with a practice in London called HTA LLP, which is looking at how to capture the quality and benefits that are derived from modular construction. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of where things are in the UK. There's some pretty amazing things happening in modular in the UK which are relevant. You know, again, we'll talk about the housing problems that we've got in the UK and how this is part of a solution. We're going to look at what the benefits are. We're going to look at what the barriers are to increased uptake and how an approach which standardises some of this could possibly help. So as has been said, I spent 10 years in the UK government working in the Department for Communities and Local Governments, now the Ministry of Housing, lots of interrelationships with housing policy, but mainly in relation to building regulations. And during that time, the reason I started to become interested in modular was that our government at the time adopted a policy called the Accelerated Construction Programme. This is a programme to try and deliver, I think it was 10 or 15,000 additional homes at a very fast rate, and that focused heavily on use of modular construction. Now, one of the lessons that we all need to learn, and policymakers need to learn, is that when you force construction sectors to adopt technology with which they're not familiar very quickly, or you throw money into construction sectors to push for particular outcomes over short spaces of time, that massively increases risk, because you're basically forcing people to use technologies and processes which they need to understand well to deliver well. So I got very interested in how we manage the risks around the growth and use of modular construction in a way that delivers a really good safe product at the other end. HTA Design LLP, who produced a lot of the content for this talk, are an architect's practice is rapidly becoming recognised as a world leader in modular design. They've done some of the tallest buildings in Europe. This is Apex House. It's the tallest modular self-supporting building in Europe. And I'll show you a project later, which is the tallest self-supporting building, modular building in the world. And they've done a lot of great thinking, but there are still questions that remain unanswered about how we actually utilize and really capture this new technology. Many people in the room will say, well, we've been here before. We've talked about modular time and time again. Every 15 years, there's a new initiative that says this is the way forward. So the question we've been trying to work together to assess, and we're working with BSI, the British Standards Institute, with the view to developing a PAS standard that can help address this. The question we're asking is, what are the barriers that we need to break down to ensure that that can actually happen? So this is just a couple more slides of the Apex House project. It's not just about tall buildings. Modulars in particular is well suited to any building projects where you've got a lot of repetition. The Apex House project is, I think, 560 student accommodation units. It's not just the tower block, it's the two-side, the red terracotta clad lower rise units. So as long as you've got the repetition and scale on site, it's an absolutely brilliant way to deliver volume very quickly, primarily beneficial into the sectors where you want fast turnover, so private rented or social rented sectors where you want to get things onto site and get the rental or get the occupation up very quickly. And these are some other projects, you know, very variable, doesn't have to be necessarily non-traditionally clad. So the projects at the bottom of the page have got an external brick-faced facade in a style that was required because of the conservation area they're being built in. And the project on the right is currently on site. It's the world's tallest residential modular building, 36 and 44 stories of self-supporting units around a slip-form concrete core. And I've got a photo of that on site at the moment. If anyone wants to see it at the end, they are literally building these slip-form cores standing entirely independently at the moment. They're incredibly high, slender structures, and it's quite fascinating to watch and see them come together. So what's the context for these questions? So I'm not going to go into these in too much detail, but you've heard it all before. And the problems we have in our sector are really pretty well understood. We really do actually understand what's wrong. It's the solutions that are difficult. But the Modernise or Die report by Mark Farmer, which came out a year or so ago, it set out a whole range of problems that are understood. Low productivity, low predictability, structural fragmentation, leadership fragmentation, low margins, adversarial relationships and pricing models, dysfunctional training, workforce size and demographics, and lack of collaboration. And it came up with three key recommendations that are relevant. First is to basically drive towards changing commissioning from traditional to pre-manufactured approaches. Second is to invest heavily in innovation, so a real drive towards adopting those technologies. And the third was to shift housing policy to, again, drive the need for housing towards the adoption of pre-manufactured technologies in their use. The UK has also got an industrial strategy that came out last year, sets out really ambitious targets for construction in the UK. So the aim is to achieve a 33% reduction in cost, 50% reduction in time for construction, 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and a 50% reduction in the trade gap around construction. I'm not sure how that's going to work out given everything else that's going on, but we'll have to see. And it had three strategic aims that underpin the whole of that agenda. Optimising the use of digital technology, increasing the use of off-site construction, and moving to an approach that appreciates and prioritises assessment methods using whole-life assessment procedures. Now, clearly the central one of those, moving to off-site construction, very relevant to modular, clear sense of that's part of the solution, part of the way that those targets are going to be achieved. But off-site and modular, also very good in terms of helping optimise the benefits of digital frameworks and BIM in particular, but also very good at improving the predictability of asset performance and durability and things like energy performance. So we also have a major housing problem in the UK. We have a massive shortage of housing. The government's now targeting 300,000 homes a year to be built. the capacity and supply issues that we have. You know, our traditional sector is pretty much maxed out. This table exemplifies the difference between supply and demand, between private and social housing. There's a big gap there to be filled, and it's primarily in the social housing sector. The private sector is not going to respond enough to meet this overall housing need. And if you're looking at rental sector, private rental or social rental, modular is really relevant. And then we've talked about Hackett. I mean, the Hackett review will have implications that are going to continue to see change in our sector in the UK, probably major changes over the next decade and changes that will be ongoing for the next 30 years, I imagine. It's absolutely fundamental that we sort out problems so that we don't see events like Grenfell Tower happening again. And quality is right at the bottom of that picture. We have, as Dame Judith has mentioned and others have pointed out, an industry predicated too much on bottom price and not on certainty of delivery of quality. And all of these considerations are relevant. So I thought it'd be good, refreshing before lunch. Last session before lunch needs some pictures of buildings to keep people awake, I think. So I just thought I'd kind of show a few of these. So this is the Apex House project I mentioned earlier. Completed 9 months from start to finish, probably somewhere around 45. I don't know the actual contract value. I think it's around 45, 50 million. Just under 600 student accommodation units. The actual construction, as you can see, the slip cores formed at one end, and 6 months later the project's entirely complete. There were never more than 12 site operatives on site. That's the most there were in terms of builders on site at any one time during this project. The change in dynamic between traditional construction and modular in that respect is just absolutely astonishing. There are, of course, other types of modular and off-site construction. Other flavours are available. Components, frame systems, panel systems, pods and volumetric. The work that I've been doing is focused largely on volumetric and modular, because as you go across this scale from elemental off-site manufactured to fully modular, you start to capture more and more of the benefits from the off-site manufacturing process. And those benefits are really serious. There are great quality gains, there's waste reduction, there's a real shift in the opportunities you can offer people. At the manufacturing base, you've got a much more stable lifestyle that's geographically located in better working conditions, so it's good for staff retention and recruitment. You've got predictability in terms of cost and performance, speed and efficiency. Commercial partnerships are more sustainable because a lot of the adversarial elements are removed. It's an entirely different way of operating, and much better safety. Fewer operatives on site and much better safety. How big are those gains? Why are they so significant? Well, these are assessments from projects. They're not kind of national statistics, but they're pretty important. So reduction in speed of delivery up to 50%, so anywhere between 20 and 60% assessed from real projects. 33% lower costs on average, 50% lower greenhouse gas emissions, 50% improvements in exports, and up to 90% reduction in waste. These processes are incredibly efficient because materials are cut exactly to size and exactly to specification, and you can really drive waste reduction. So overall, you've got quicker construction, earlier rent returns, less disruption. You've got more sustainable buildings, greater confidence that design is deliverable. But there are things you need to do differently. You need to engage earlier with manufacturers. You need timely decision-making from client that's in a different structure to others. Designers need to understand the discipline of designing for manufacture, designing these buildings. It's a different process, and procurement's different, so you need to think differently about that. What does that look like in practice? So this diagram shows in orange the amount of time spent by the design team on a modular building versus the blue block, which is the design team time on a traditional construction, similar size projects. And what you can see, obviously, is design time is roughly similar, but the actual cost and the design time consumed by dealing with a modular project on site is astonishingly smaller. And I look at that blue area, the difference between the orange and blue area on the right-hand side of this, as being symptomatic of all the things that Mark Farmer listed as, being problematic. Adversarial relationships, supply chains not being very effective, disputes, contractual changes, value engineering during the project, dealing with design changes resulting from subcontractor design portions that are not complete at the time that you start the work. All of those issues, that's the difference that's there. And the architects I speak to who work on these projects, they love doing the modular, and they love it, not because it makes them more money, but because their quality of life as architects working on those projects is so much better. It is such a different experience to work on the modular projects compared to traditional, because they have a high degree of certainty that what they've designed is going to be built. The entire focus of the project team is on delivering what's been designed, and the fragmented and poor business models that are problematic for many traditional projects just aren't there. So they're all they love it. They're totally won over. It's a totally different life experience for them, and I think that is we shouldn't ignore those wins for people's quality of life. There's also a really big economic incentive if you can turn over your development more quickly, because there's a big speed gain in this. Remember, anywhere between 3 to 6 months on substantive projects. You can actually do more projects within any given time frame. That means you're actually going to maximise and deliver much better financial performance to your investors. This is another project in Greenwich. Again, slip-formed concrete core, freestanding, self-supporting units built around that. So the only structural element that's in situ on site is typically a transfer slab, which deals with any kind of ground level multi-purpose use. Above that, all of these units are simply stacked on top of each other and take the weight. The structural design is stronger at the bottom than it is at the top, but it's usually done in staggered stages. But the actual construction of the units isn't necessarily anything particularly spectacular. There's a unit on the right there. It's fairly simple construction, but everything's pre-fitted out. In a factory, the quality is inspected at the end of every day. The unit doesn't progress to the next bit of work until quality standards have been met. The contractors needed to do the bit of work are always available at the time that's needed. It really does make a huge difference. So you can see a transfer slab and core on the left, and then the way that these units are stacked and assembled around the core. Again, just another diagram kind of exemplifying how these buildings fit together. And this is part of the benefit as well, of course. You've got a fully designed set of service installations. You've got a fully designed set of structural elements. These steel frames that are used, they're Metsec steel frames. They are cut in a way that you can only slot them together in one way. They're like super efficient IKEA units. So there's no way that anyone can put a stud or a noggin or a piece of the structure in the wrong place. And that means that absolutely everything is where it's designed to be, which means that for asset owners, people taking over the buildings, if they want to know where a pipe's running or where the ventilation ductwork is or where a stud is, it is precisely where it is recorded as being. There are none of the really avoidable collisions between services or other elements. You get precisely what you design. And again, just further detail on the way that these modular units and packages come together. When they're put together, there's a process called zipping up, which is about actually just putting the interface elements in between the units. So you put in cover plates, but you can actually pre-commission all the services so that you know they perform, and then just plug them together when they arrive on site. Just some further drawings. The building on the right here actually has a scaffolding around the outside because of planning requirements for the external facade material had to be in situ. And as we'll see, planning can be something of an issue when the requirements start to kind of erode some of the benefits of modular, but it's not the kind of key thing. So one of the big questions we're looking at is how do you actually standardize this? So we've been doing a lot of analytical work trying to map out all of the thinking that's been done over the years on these issues. And going back to benefits, there are lots of specific benefits that have been identified. There are some really big macroeconomic benefits. So it was very interesting looking earlier about the discussion about how to balance the economy in Ireland. We have a similar issue in the UK. One of the advantages of off-site manufacture is that you can manufacture in areas with lower economic activity where you've got more available workforce and shift them into the areas where there's higher housing demand. You can start to balance all sorts of aspects of your economy. But these benefits really are pretty well evidenced now and are pretty material, and they're pretty substantive. As I was saying, you get a lot of certainty of construction. You really do know what you're getting, and that is not just good for the actual construction team, but as I said, for operators and maintainers, it's great. And you've got better data. The data you're recording is, you know, the difficulty getting as-built drawings on projects is universal. Not with these projects. They really do deliver. You also get the benefits of a manufacturing mindset and culture. It's a completely different approach. It's about delivering exactly what the client wants and then improving it the next time that it's delivered. It gives you an opportunity to actually make real benefits from post-occupancy evaluation, because the design or project team that you work with is the project team you work with again more often. And they have a product, a standardized product, against which they can actually drive performance. And that opens up the manufacturing of these buildings to thinking from other sectors. So advanced product quality planning is a quality improvement process developed by the 5 big American car manufacturers. You can't do that with most of the way that we procure traditionally. So the question is, if it's so great, why isn't everyone doing this already? In the UK, the sector is about 6,000 units a year, so it's still relatively small. And the answer is that there are a lot of structural constraints. These are the reasons why we've been here before and things haven't quite taken off. Economic cycles are more difficult to manage because these businesses, manufacturing has fixed overheads. It doesn't have the cost and risk divestment models that traditional contracting does. There's confidence in the ability to capture benefits for clients. So they ask, really, am I going to get the benefits at the other end of this? And part of that problem is confidence in knowing how to procure the off-site systems so that the actual cost and performance benefits are realised. There's a difficult feedback loop between clients and the manufacturing sector. And a chunk of the UK housing market, the volume house builders, have what's known as a low absorption rate model, which basically means that they trickle new supply into the marketplace to retain premium and profitability rather than delivering high volumes as quickly as possible. So only part of the UK housing sector is really interested in this faster delivery model, although the skills shortage is really starting to change the volume builders' view as to whether they may need to look at this as well. We've mapped out a whole range of what we call client-side barriers. So these are either behaviours or issues for clients. I'm not going to go into them in infinite detail. Scale and critical mass. So clients actually commissioning enough work in this sector to encourage growth. Client knowledge and confidence. A whole range of issues around understanding how to procure, structure, finance, insurance. How to argue within organisations that this is a sensible thing to do. Finance and cost. You need a different approach to the way you finance these projects because you are paying a lot more upfront for the manufacture of units off-site before the materials arrive into the site boundaries. You need a different approach to how you insure risk. It's all doable, but it's unfamiliar. Some mortgage markets, some parts of the mortgage market are nervous because the performance and reliability of these systems isn't as well understood as traditional. It's worth noting that it's not that traditional is better or more reliable, it's just they know what goes wrong with traditional in more detail. And then, as I said, there are kind of insurance and risk issues. For the industry, for manufacturing to be effective, you need your facilities to be running at capacity. You need the throughput that's very steady. So those problems on the client side with confidence in commissioning mean that manufacturers often have gaps in that supply capacity, which reduces their profitability and certainty of profitability, which impacts on investment. There are structural issues in terms of leadership. Challenge of moving away from diversified supply chains is a problem for many clients and developers. And there's still development on contractual mechanisms. Fixed factory costs I've mentioned already. And the investment cost needed, the upfront investment cost, is seen as a barrier. Some of the permissions that are required are difficult. So planning permissions that require you bring employment to an area are difficult. If you've only got 12 operatives on site at one time, it's hard to deliver really big apprenticeship or training schemes, which is a requirement a lot of the time. Traditional material exteriors can mitigate the speed benefits, and you need a different approach to building control sign-off. You know, these units that I've been looking at and showing you here today are manufactured outside the UK. Who does the inspection? How do you quality assure and make compliance checks on those? And there's a lack of standardised approach to commissioning. So standardisation is a really big issue here, as are the need to integrate main contractors in site work. So overall, what you get is a kind of suboptimal cycle where you've got suboptimal procurement, suboptimal scheme design, you reduce or lose the benefits of off-site. That mitigates the incentives for clients and makes it harder to drive increased supply. So our view is there's no lack of demand for new sources of supply. We have a big housing supply problem. We don't have the capacity in our traditional marketplace. We've got a skills shortage coming towards us that's really, really big. There's a lack of capacity and understanding to actually capture these. It's all about confidence and knowledge. So we've been working through looking at information issue, what the information is that's needed by people within the sector. And we really think the standardisation can help, and it can help in a lot of ways. We can set standardised methods and approaches to procurement that offset risks. So all of the insurance risks, the way that you need to restructure your financial processes, the way that you need to look at quality assuring, we can look at a standardised process that industry can buy into as managing that risk for them and then improve it over time. We need to have, most critically, a way to ensure that scheme designs are not tied into single suppliers. So the fundamental barrier to clients adopting modular, more than any other reason, is that they're nervous that when they commission their design team right at the beginning of the process to use a modular system, they have to design to the specifications of the different systems that are available. There's not a big variety of those, but they're all different. And that locks them into a supply chain with one supplier. They're nervous about that because if your planning permission delays your ability to get on site, you lose your production slot potentially. You may well not be able to utilise that supplier because they'll be booked out on something else. You lose all the speed benefits. You've got a site that's permissioned, but you can't progress. The approach we think will work is to create sufficient standardisation across all of the modular and volumetric housing types so that the industry can converge on those models. So standardising basically allows clients to have confidence they've got a diverse range of suppliers at the other end. They can then maximise whether they want competition or whether they want certainty, and that will, we think, drive things better. The information products that are needed for that are fairly obvious, but you know, standardised glossary and terminology, the industry is still sufficiently young that there's an opportunity to drive a lot of benefits through that. But these generic design parameters and design rules for modular are absolutely key to capturing these benefits. And what you get from that is a procurement cycle which is optimised for modular. There's always the opportunity to switch back, has flexible scheme design, optimises and captures the benefits, and enables people to actually procure with confidence. So there's some way to go, but actually I think we really do understand what the problems are. The big question that I have come away from looking at this sector for 2 years is why can't the traditional sector learn a lot from what's going on here? Because many of the things that are said to be unique about off-site manufacturing aren't unique. It's a business model, it's a mindset, it's an approach to focusing on delivering what the client wants rather than satisfying pretty much flawed business models that require disruption in order to rebuild margins where we've had a bottom pricing culture. So I think, in summary, there's a great deal to be benefited from by making this work. I don't think we're far away from actually standardising the knowledge that we need to enable people to do that with confidence. But there's also a lot that we can then feed back into our other parts of the industry, which we also need. It's not one or the other. We need everything firing at on all cylinders. to deliver the housing and the buildings that we need. So thank you very much.